China placed 500,000 troops to combat the U.S. in the South China Sea. The head of the Chinese delegation at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore accused the U.S. of being a true source of militarization in the disputed waterway. China has more than 500,000 troops on the islands it claims in the South China Sea, the head of the country's military delegation at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore said on Saturday in response to criticism by U.S. Defense Secretary James N. Mattis. Deploying troops and weapons on the islands of the South China Sea is within the sovereign right of China to be exercised and permitted by international law, said He Lei, a lieutenant general with the People's Liberation Army. All irresponsible statements on this issue are violations of China's internal affairs, he told a news conference just 2 hours after Mattis said in his speech at the event that Beijing had intimidated and forced its neighbors into its military activities in the disputed waterway. He also likened the construction of military posts in the South China Sea to the decision by the late Supreme Leader Deng Xiaoping to send a PLA garrison to Hong Kong after the 1997 surrender, in a show of state sovereignty in the region. His comments were the first at a public and international event to recognize Beijing's plans to base troops and weapons on natural and man-made islands in the Paracel and Spratly Islands. China has previously insisted that its development on a series of small islands, reefs, territorial rights that are still fiercely contested by some countries and territories, will only be used for defense purposes. Although he countered Mattis's accusation, saying that close-range surveillance carried out by 2 U.S. warships, which sailed 12 nautical miles from the Paracel Islands last week, was the true source of militarization in the region. In a meeting with former President Barack Obama during a visit to the U.S. in 2015, Chinese President Xi Jinping denied the country had plans to build a military fort in the South China Sea. Satellite images released last month showed that Beijing had built at least 4 airfields suitable for military aircraft, on Woody Island in Paracels, and in Fiery Cross, Mischief and Subi reefs in the Spratly Islands. They also showed Chinese H-6K strategic bombers taking part in takeoff and landing exercises at Woody, and the presence of YJ-12B anti-ship cruise missiles and long-range HQ-9B surface-to-air missiles at Fiery Cross, Crime and Subi. Andre Chong, chief editor of the Canadian-based Conwa Asian Defense Military magazine, said Beijing had realized that it was impossible to continue to cover up the true nature of its plans for the coral reef of the South China Sea. Satellite images show Beijing has increased progress in militarization of the island's posts, which will become PLA naval and air bases in the future, he said on the sidelines of the Shangri-La Dialogue. Facilities and buildings flanked by radar equipment on small islands are not for civilian use, but are large-scale military complexes, he said. Meanwhile, he, who is also vice president of the PLA Military Sciences Academy, criticized Mattis' statement about Washington's relations with Taipei. The Pentagon chief said the U.S. was strongly committed to working with Taiwan to provide defense articles consistent with the obligations laid down in our Taiwan Relations Act. He responded by saying, the Chinese government and its people strongly oppose arms sales to Taiwan, all kinds of official government contacts to strengthen their relations with Taipei, as well as other actions to undermine the One Chinese principle. The People's Liberation Army has the determination, trust and ability to protect the safety, territorial sovereignty, integrity and interests that develop in the country, he said. Zhao Xiaozhou, a senior researcher at the Military Academy of Sciences, said that his comments suggested the PLA might move closer to considering military action to recapture Taiwan if Washington insisted on supporting the island, and tended to be progressive, Democratic Progressive Party leaning towards independence. The DPP does not recognize the 1992 consensus and understanding that there is only one China, but that Beijing and Taipei can have their own interpretations of what that means. Andrew Yang, a former Taiwan defense minister who was also present at the security conference in Singapore, said he hoped the U.S. would be careful about Taiwan's problems not to provoke the mainland to take military action against the self-governed island. The United States will not be careless and do things that will make the mainland think it interferes with internal affairs, he said. U.S. support for Taiwan is always strong, but we also have to see how the government of U.S. President Donald Trump reacts. Taiwan law will not immediately apply and the U.S. will consider its own interests.